welcome. You're watching a very special episode of India Global. I'm Gaurie Dwivedi. The flux in US politics, well, doesn't seem to end. It was only last week that Donald Trump had an assassination attempt. And well, this week we had Joe Biden formally exiting the presidential race. 100 days before US goes to polls, we don't know who is now Donald Trump facing. It seems it could be Kamala Harris because she's got the endorsement of President Biden, but that's not a certainty. She needs to go through the entire process of becoming the official Democrat nominee for the upcoming presidential elections. Could there be some surprises? What is it in store for the next couple of weeks for the entire process? The ramifications this has for the uncertainty and the flux that America is facing, and the ripple effects that could happen in other parts of the world. Those are some of the areas that we'll try and touch upon in the next 30 minutes in this episode of India Global. But let's first start with getting the very latest from ground zero. We have Patsy Widakuswara joining us, who's a White House Bureau Chief, Voice of America, joining us to tell us what really is the very latest on that. Patsy, thanks much for speaking to me, speaking to NDTV. On the latest as far as US elections are concerned, talk to us that what's the buzz now in the Democrat camp. The Biden presidential camp has now transferred in fact, into a Harris presidential camp, even though there is no final word on her nomination as the presidential candidate.
Since Joe Biden endorsed Kamala Harris, Kamala Harris has raised, well, the Biden-Harris team, essentially, Democrats have raised $50 million. That's one of the highest amount that the party has raised in its history. And Kamala Harris herself has spent the whole of Sunday calling over 100 Democratic leaders, governors, and other party actors, saying that even though she appreciates Joe Biden's endorsement, she intends to earn this nomination. So she spent all day working the phones, speaking to them. So from here now on, it's still not clear what would happen. As of this point, Monday morning in Washington, D.C., no other viable candidate has said that they are going to run for the nomination. But there's still the possibility of the so-called, vanity candidates who are running even though they don't have any kind of substantive support from the party. If these people run and if the Democrats decide that there should be a process, then there will be some contest, either a debate or something that projects a sense of democracy, a sense of, that this is not an automatic coronation just because Joe Biden says that he wants Kamala Harris now to run, and that is the rule of the land, because there is no such rule. Under the American system, when we go to the ballot booth in the summer, when we vote for the Biden-Harris ticket, what we're essentially voting for is for delegates to attend the National Convention, and for the Democrats, it's in this upcoming August, and they will pledge their votes to the ticket. And right now, that ticket is still open. Right now, it seems like Harris will be the top of the ticket, but that is not a foregone conclusion. And we still have to decide who will be the bottom of the ticket. Right now, for political calculations, it's key for the Democrats to capture that kind of Midwestern part of the country, predominantly white, predominantly Christian, perhaps not so open or receptive to the idea of the ticket being like a double minority, a woman ticket, or a minority and minority ticket. So the likelihood of the Democrats settling on a second vice president candidate or nominee being a white male from the Midwest, that's what's being talked about right now. But again, at this point, this is all speculation because nothing has been confirmed yet. One other thing that I can perhaps report on from Washington, D.C. is this kind of growing calls from Republicans for President Biden to resign, because they're saying that if he is not fit to run, then he is not fit to rule. Obviously, this is a play by Republicans to continue the pressure on Democrats. The White House has not responded to those calls, for Biden to resign. Neither has Democratic leaders. That has no bearing constitutionally in the American system. If the president doesn't want to run again for his second term, it doesn't mean that he cannot finish his first term.
Okay, that pretty much is the story right now, that there are just too many questions and very few answers. Exactly the state that we are with the conversation with Patsy, that more questions than answers. Okay, let's get in some of our guests to discuss this in greater detail. We have Nish Achara, who's a former advisor to Biden administration, former director of innovation and entrepreneurship for President Obama, joining us from Boston. Nish, you are up to speed with what has happened so far, the last 12, 15 odd hours. As I said, there are still some questions, but I want to now ask you this, that what could, if we are to go with a Harris presidential candidature and a possible presidency there, what are we really looking at? Are we looking at a different stance from President Biden when it comes to abortion, immigration, those teething issues, those thorny issues on which America continues to be voting on? Is there, on those issues, does Kamala Harris share Biden's views, or does she have a different view that we need to now look out for?
Well, I think a couple of things before I answer that. I think first, it was just an amazing, selfless act for President Biden to determine not to continue with the campaign. We see this rarely in politics anywhere in the world, where people will voluntarily step aside for what's best for the country via the election process. So that is amazing. And I think you'll see that Vice President Harris, there is, as we say in the United States, there is no daylight between President Biden and Vice President Harris's agenda, meaning that it will be very, very similar. President Biden has been incredibly consequential on infrastructure, on electrification, on standing up to Russia and other bullies around the world. And I think Vice President Harris will continue with almost the exact same policies and the exact same philosophy, which is to build a more inclusive economy and engage more people. So I think on all things policy, we'll be very similar. Of course, she's going to have initiatives that are more important to her. I think access to healthcare for women is something she's spoken about significantly for years. I think taking a different approach with law enforcement and addressing some of the thorny issues we have in the United States. As a former prosecutor, that will be important to her. But overall, I think when you think about where the United States is going and the amazing job that President Biden did helping us get out of COVID and navigate one challenge after another, whether it's interest rates, supply chain, the war in Ukraine, all of that, I think the vice president will continue with very much the same broad agenda and concept of a more inclusive economy, a more inclusive world.
Okay, but so are we then to believe two things? Before I get in Mr. Peter Kuznik, who's Professor of History, Director, Nuclear Studies Institute, American University, joining us from Washington. Before I get him, Nish, just a follow-up question, then are we then to believe that there won't be any surprises going forward? Because as I said, she may be having a view that is slightly nuanced, more nuanced as compared to President Biden.
Right.
And these are issues on which American election pretty much stands on. Abortion, immigration and stuff like that. Maybe trade could be the other pillar.
Sure, I'm sure there'll be some changes based on her own experience, her own views. So, but the general direction in which the United States will go, which is a fairer form of globalization, more sort of holistic view around fighting climate change, a more inclusive economy. I think those general conceptual areas will be the exact same, and she'll put her stamp on things slightly differently than President Biden has done. And I think she'll lay that out. I think certainly in the area of healthcare for women, which is not just abortion. I think it's overall access to healthcare, which is changed at the state level in the United States. That will be a signature issue for her. That will be slightly perhaps more elevated than it was under President Biden, and a few things like that. But overall, I think the important thing for the Indian audience to know is that the general strains of U.S. policy will stay in the same direction with President Harris as it did with President Biden. And that's good because I think the economy has straightened out in many ways. We've post-COVID, all of that sort of thing. So, and in terms of surprises, I don't think, obviously the person she names as her potential running mate is the main surprise we're looking at right now. There's a lot of really good candidates, and who she decides to pick, whether it's a specific community group or a state.
So we'll come to her running mate in just a bit, but before that, I want to quickly play out some of these graphics in terms of what really who is Kamala Harris and what next for Democrats? Let's play out some of those graphics. First is, of course, a quick background of what has been Kamala Harris's journey. She's 59 years old, born to Indian mother Shamla Gopalan. First female black South Asian vice president. She was also the San Francisco district attorney to the presidential nominee. That's been her political journey, and some of the 10 contentious issues on which, as I said, America votes, abortion being one of them. She supports the right to abortion nationally. That's a departure from what President Biden's approach is, and of course a complete contrast to the Republican view. We'll come to that in a bit. I am hopeful that Amy Tarkanian will also join us on this program to talk to us about, well, the Trump campaign as well, because they were, of course, preparing and focusing on taking on Biden, but he doesn't seem to be in the race anymore. So how does that impact the Trump campaign? Okay, but also on the Israel-Gaza war. In March 2023, it was Kamala Harris who had called for ceasefire in the Gaza war, and she supports a two-state solution, which is pretty much in line with what the American position has been on this contentious issue. All right, Professor Peter Kuznik, let me ask you, sir, at this stage, do you see the uncertainty in American politics subsiding from here on, or do you see the next couple of weeks could be more volatile for American politics than, say, in the last 5 decades?
I think it's going to be a combination of the two. I think the turmoil that has engulfed the Democratic Party is going to subside to a certain extent, but we're going to see a much more vigorous campaign against the Republicans. So politically, it's an interesting time. There's clearly a lot of pressure to crown Kamala Harris, to anoint her as the Democratic nominee, despite the fact that she's probably not the strongest candidate, and that in many ways she's too closely tied to the Biden presidency. However, there are a lot of other reasons why she's a likely choice in terms of the party mechanisms, in terms of the funding. She already raised $50 million yesterday. So do the Democrats want to risk a messy process now? The problem is that the same party elders, the same elites, the same conservative leaders in the Democratic Party who clung to Biden much too long and who have not had any kind of vigorous presence have chosen her. So I think that this is, I think that that's probably the direction we're going, but I don't think it's the wisest choice for the Democrats now. I think that we could probably see a much more exciting team with much more vision. And I would love to see, if we were starting from scratch, a Gretchen Whitmer, Wes Moore ticket, I think would be very potent and would really give the Republicans their run for their money. But Kamala Harris is strong enough to defeat Donald Trump, and she could probably get the nomination much more easily than anybody else, of course, at this point.
Okay, so let's play that graphic out where we are talking about the 5 things to know about what's next. When might we see new polling? What is, of course, Kamala Harris doing? She should be working the phones. She is doing just that. She's got a lot of donors on her side as well. Donations in the last 24 hours have been coming in. And of course, who should be her replacement? Is it going to be her, or are there other names? As you mentioned, Josh Shapiro, clearly a big favorite with a lot of people because he's slightly centrist in his approach and is considered to be quite a favorite as well, apart from some of the other names. Let's play out that graphic. And Nish, then let me ask you just this, that the coronation, the choice or choosing of Kamala Harris, just the kind of remarks that have been coming in from a lot of people within the Democratic quarters as well, that we've signed up for the entire process. Now just 100 days left for the election to start, and now we cannot have somebody just being parachuted into the middle of the election, and the process should be followed in its spirit, which is go back to the original state. Can Democrats do that? Do they have time on their hands?
Right. So just a quick clarification. President Biden has been 100% pro-choice and in favor of national availability of abortion services. So he's been exactly the same as Vice President Harris on that front. But on your question, so there is a process and it is open right now. The Democratic Convention is in 3 weeks. That's the place where the nominee is given the formal confirmation by the elected Democrats that the person is the nominee. So that hasn't happened yet. And so while it is late, and of course, Vice President Harris has gotten all the nominations in the last 24 hours, the rules are being followed as they were set out. Now, if people want an open process, that's completely understandable. That is the ideal way to do it. But we also have only 100 days until the election, and the election is very consequential. And so what we're struggling with right now is the need to be open and democratic, while at the same time quickly getting organized in order to compete in this election in 50 states and really in 10, 12 states where things are going to be decided. And so that requires speed and organization and money. And so what you're seeing is Democrats line up and say, okay, we can quickly do this around the vice president, who has been elected nationally. She was elected across the country in 2020, along with President Biden. Let's quickly align around the vice president. Let's fight the election on an extraordinarily similar agenda and platform as the president has. And the other candidates that have been mentioned are all incredible. They're really great, and we hope to see them on the national stage, and hopefully they'll speak at the convention as well.
Professor Kuznik, how do you react to these a fair bit of clamor within the Democrat camp as well, where I've been reading and hearing that Kamala Harris needs to earn her candidature. It's not a done deal. Yes, she's been endorsed by some important people, former presidents, Hillary Clinton, but she still needs to earn her candidature. She needs to earn her nomination. How do you respond to that? And more importantly, do the Democratic Party have the time to conduct that entire process?
I believe the Democrats do have the time to conduct a more open process. And Kamala Harris may very well prevail. She was not the strongest candidate in 2020 when she was running. She didn't win any primaries. She has not done a lot to distinguish herself as vice president. She's been associated with the immigration policy, which is not the strong suit for the Biden administration. However, as was just being said, she's very strong on women's health, on reproductive rights. She can, the contrast between her as a prosecutor and Donald Trump as a convicted felon will play very, very well. She has spoken out a little bit more quickly about the situation in Gaza. I fear that she'll still be too closely aligned with Biden's foreign policy, which I think is a real liability for the Democrats. Hopefully, she'll be more open to diplomacy, especially when it comes to Ukraine, than Biden has been.
All right. We'll have to wrap it up right now. And as I said, and what I said at the beginning of this discussion, which is that there are enough and more questions. And what happens in the United States impacts every country and, of course, also markets. I wish we had time to even talk about how the markets around the world have been reacting to the uncertainty that will be in political systems as far as US is concerned the next fortnight or maybe 3 weeks. But that's all I have time for in this edition of India Global. Thanks so much for watching.